I used to believe that the worst mistakes announced themselves loudly, that they arrived with warnings, raised voices, and obvious consequences. I was wrong. Some mistakes arrive quietly, disguised as comfort, routine, and someone asking how your day really was. That was how it began for me, long before I ever understood where it might lead. My name is Ethan, and at the time, my life looked stable from the outside. I was in a committed relationship with Daniel, my boyfriend of 2 years. We weren't perfect, but we were loyal, or at least, that's what I told myself. Daniel had taken a job in another city 6 months earlier, and what we called temporary distance slowly turned into a permanent ache. We spoke every day, sent good morning texts, shared updates about work and plans for a future we kept postponing. Yet with every call, something essential seemed missing. His voice was there, but his attention often wasn't. Conversations ended with polite affection instead of warmth, and I learned not to complain, because I didn't want to sound needy. To manage the rent, I found a roommate. That's how Lucas entered my life. Lucas moved in on a rainy Sunday afternoon, carrying only 2 suitcases and an easy confidence that made small talk feel unnecessary. He was friendly without being intrusive, observant without prying. From the beginning, he had a way of noticing details: when I skipped dinner, when I came home quieter than usual, when I laughed just a little too hard at nothing. I told myself he was just considerate. I didn't ask why. That felt so rare. Living together settled into a rhythm faster than I expected. We shared groceries, late-night meals, and the kind of conversations that happen when the television is on but neither person is watching. Lucas talked about his past without drama, revealing pieces of himself carefully, like someone who had learned what happens when you give too much away too quickly. I listened. More than that, I stayed present. And he noticed. Daniel, meanwhile, felt farther away each week. Our calls became shorter, often interrupted by work or exhaustion. When I mentioned feeling lonely, he reassured me with promises instead of changes. I understood his pressure, his ambition, his stress. Understanding became my habit, even when it cost me something. I never stopped loving him, but love began to feel like responsibility rather than connection. What unsettled me most was how effortless things felt with Lucas. There was no expectation, no history to manage, no future to negotiate. Just 2 people sharing space, laughter, and an unspoken ease. I never crossed a line, at least, not in any way I could clearly define. But I began to look forward to his presence in a way that made me uncomfortable. When I heard his key in the door, I felt lighter. When he wasn't home, the apartment felt emptier than it should have done. I reminded myself, often and firmly, that I was taken. That Lucas was just my roommate. That attraction, fleeting or imagined, didn't mean betrayal. I repeated these thoughts like rules, believing rules alone could control feelings. Still, I noticed how carefully I chose my clothes on evenings we planned to cook together, how easily my guard lowered when he asked simple questions. I noticed, and I said nothing. One night, after a particularly strained call with Daniel, I sat alone in the living room, staring at my phone long after the screen had gone dark. Lucas came home later than usual and immediately sensed something was off. He didn't push. He just sat down, close enough to be comforting, far enough to be respectful. That restraint made everything harder to ignore. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, then shook my head, unsure which answer was more honest. In that moment, I realized how much I had already let him see. Not just my routines, but my uncertainty. My disappointment. My loneliness. Things I used to save only for Daniel now surfaced naturally with Lucas, without intention or planning. That realization should have stopped me. Instead, it made me afraid of what I was becoming, and of how easy it felt. Later that night, alone in my room, I told myself nothing was wrong. That closeness didn't equal betrayal. That feelings, unacted upon, were harmless. I believed it because I needed to. Because admitting otherwise would mean admitting I was standing at the edge of something I never meant to approach. I fell asleep repeating one promise to myself: nothing would happen. It was the first lie I told that mattered. After that night, nothing in the apartment returned to how it had been before. The furniture hadn't moved, the routine stayed intact, yet something invisible had shifted. I noticed it in the pauses between conversations, in the way silence no longer felt empty but charged. Lucas hadn't changed his behavior, not overtly. If anything, he seemed more careful. It was that careful distance that made me think about him more. My relationship with Daniel continued to thin under the weight of distance. We still spoke daily, but our calls felt scheduled rather than desired. He asked how my day was, and I answered honestly, but selectively. I didn't mention Lucas. Not because anything had happened, but because something had begun to matter, and that frightened me more than guilt ever could. Lucas became the person who noticed when I was tired before I said so. He offered quiet company instead of advice, which somehow felt more intimate. When we talked, it was never about romance or longing, yet everything circled those subjects without naming them. We spoke about work, about disappointment, about the fear of choosing the wrong life and waking up too late to fix it. In those conversations, I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in months. That I told myself it was harmless. People were allowed to connect. Loneliness didn't make someone disloyal. These thoughts formed a careful defense, one I relied on whenever my conscience stirred. Still, I began to measure my days by small things, whether Lucas would be home for dinner, whether we'd talk late into the night, whether he would laugh at something insignificant and make the room feel warmer. The night everything shifted arrived without drama. No celebration, no argument, no obvious turning point. I had spent the day replaying a tense conversation with Daniel, one where neither of us had said what we truly meant. By the time I got home, I felt drained, restless, and strangely hollow. Lucas noticed immediately. "You look like you've been carrying something all day," he said. That was all it took. That I followed him into the bathroom, not because it was meaningful, but because it was quiet. The door closed behind us, and suddenly the space felt smaller than it ever had before. The hum of the fan filled the silence, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I stared at the sink, at my reflection, at the version of myself that looked composed while feeling anything but. Lucas stood beside me, close enough that I could sense his presence without touching him. He didn't reach out. He didn't push. That restraint made my thoughts louder. I became acutely aware of my breathing, of the tension in my shoulders, of how quickly my heart was moving. Every part of me wanted clarity, either distance or honesty, but the moment offered neither. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I admitted quietly. Lucas met my eyes in the mirror. His expression held concern, but also something deeper, something unspoken. He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't reassure me with empty words. He simply listened, and that listening felt dangerously intimate. In that confined space, with the door closed and the world reduced to a few square feet, I realized how fragile my boundaries had become. Nothing physical happened. No lines were crossed in ways that could be easily named. Yet standing there, sharing vulnerability in silence, I felt the unmistakable weight of choice. I could step back, change the subject, reclaim the distance I'd promised myself. Or I could stay exactly where I was, acknowledging what neither of us was ready to say. Eventually, I moved away first. I mumbled an apology that didn't quite fit the moment and stepped past him, my pulse still racing. Lucas didn't stop me. He didn't follow. That, too, felt significant. Later, alone in my room, I tried to convince myself that nothing had happened. There were no secrets to confess, no actions to undo. And yet, I couldn't ignore the truth pressing against my thoughts. Emotional distance could be crossed as easily as physical space. I had stepped into something without knowing how to step back out. The apartment felt different after that night. Not broken, not ruined, just altered. Every shared glance carried meaning. Every silence asked a question. I knew then that pretending nothing had changed was no longer possible. That I went to sleep understanding one unsettling truth: the hardest betrayals don't begin with touch. They begin when you realize you want to stay where you shouldn't. The days after that night unfolded with an uneasy precision, as if the apartment itself were aware of what had changed. Lucas and I continued our routines, but each interaction felt measured, deliberate. We spoke politely, sometimes warmly, yet there was a carefulness beneath every word. It was the kind of restraint that only exists when two people know they are avoiding something important. That I felt the weight of it most during my calls with Daniel. His voice still brought comfort, but it no longer anchored me the way it once had. When he asked about my day, I edited my answers instinctively. I talked about work, about being tired, about missing him. I did not talk about the quiet evenings in the apartment or the way Lucas had learned my moods without asking. Each omission felt small, but together they formed a distance I could no longer ignore. Lucas seemed to pull back as well. He spent more time in his room, stayed out later, filled silences with casual remarks instead of meaningful ones. I wondered if he was protecting himself, or protecting me. Either possibility unsettled me. What we hadn't named lingered between us, shaping our behavior more than any spoken agreement could have. One evening, the tension finally demanded recognition. We were in the kitchen, standing on opposite sides of the counter, when Lucas broke the silence. "Things feel strange," he said quietly. "I don't want them to." I looked at him, at the familiar lines of his face now edged with uncertainty. For a moment, I considered pretending I didn't know what he meant. It would have been easier. Instead, I nodded. "They do," I admitted. "And I think we both know why." We didn't speak about the bathroom, or about feelings in any explicit way. We didn't need to. The understanding was already there. Lucas said he respected my relationship, that he didn't want to be the reason anyone got hurt. Hearing that made the truth harder, not easier. It forced me to acknowledge that the responsibility rested with me. That night, I lay awake thinking about the word infidelity. I had always believed it referred to action, to a clear moment where someone chose betrayal. But lying there, replaying conversations and glances, I understood how narrow that definition was. Trust erodes quietly. Loyalty weakens through attention given in the wrong direction. I hadn't touched anyone, yet I had allowed my emotional honesty to shift away from the person who had earned it. The next day, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice carried a seriousness that made my chest tighten. He said he felt a distance he couldn't explain, that something in me seemed changed. For a brief, selfish moment, I considered denying it. Telling him he was imagining things. Preserving the version of myself that hadn't yet faced consequences. Instead, I told him the truth, carefully, imperfectly, but honestly, that I explained that I had grown lonely, that I had formed a connection I didn't fully understand, and that it had made me question things I thought were solid. I didn't blame him. I didn't excuse myself. I simply spoke, and let the silence that followed exist. Daniel listened without interrupting, and when he finally spoke, his disappointment was quiet, not angry. That hurt more than any accusation could have done. We didn't end the call with resolution. There were no dramatic decisions, no promises about the future. Only an agreement to take space and consider what honesty required next. When the call ended, I felt both lighter and unbearably exposed. Lucas noticed the change immediately. He didn't ask for details, only offered presence. This time, I declined. Not because I didn't want his comfort, but because I understood how easily comfort could become escape. Setting that boundary felt necessary, even painful. It was the first deliberate choice I had made in weeks. As the days passed, I began to see my situation more clearly. I wasn't a victim of circumstance or confusion. I was someone who had avoided discomfort until it found me anyway. The realization was sobering, but it carried a strange sense of relief. Responsibility, once accepted, leaves little room for illusion. One evening, standing alone in the apartment, I understood that the story wasn't about a moment or a place. It was about the slow drift away from honesty, and the courage it takes to return. I didn't know what would happen with Daniel, or how living with Lucas would change after everything acknowledged but unresolved. What I did know was this: I could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. The choice ahead of me, between avoidance and integrity, was unavoidable now. And whatever came next would demand more from me than silence ever had. The apartment grew quieter after that, not from absence but from intention. Lucas and I moved through shared spaces with mutual awareness, careful not to reopen something neither of us knew how to resolve. Our conversations were courteous, even kind, yet stripped of the intimacy that once came so naturally. It felt like walking through a familiar place after a storm, recognizable, but changed in subtle, permanent ways. The distance between Daniel and me deepened into something heavier than silence. Days passed without messages, then weeks marked only by brief, practical exchanges. The pause he had asked for forced me to confront my thoughts without distraction. I replayed every decision that had led me here, not to punish myself, but to understand how easily I had traded honesty for comfort. Reflection, I learned, is unavoidable when there's nowhere left to hide. Lucas eventually broke the quiet one evening, not with questions, but with clarity. I think we should talk, he said, his voice steadied as we sat across from each other at the small dining table, the same place where laughter had once filled the room. He told me he was considering moving out when the lease allowed it. Not out of resentment, but out of respect, for boundaries, for healing, for the truth we had both acknowledged. His calm acceptance made the moment unexpectedly painful. It was easier to resist temptation than to face the consequences of restraint. I don't regret meeting you, he said. But I don't want either of us stuck in something that keeps us from being honest with ourselves. I thanked him, knowing gratitude was an insufficient response. What he offered was not rejection, but accountability. It reminded me that care, when genuine, doesn't always pull people closer. Sometimes it creates the space they need to grow. That night, alone again, I finally allowed myself to grieve, not just the uncertainty with Daniel, but the version of myself I thought I was. I had believed loyalty was instinctive, that it required no maintenance. Now I understood it was an active choice, one that demanded attention, effort, and uncomfortable truth. Losing sight of that had been my quiet undoing. A message from Daniel arrived days later. He said he needed to see me, not to argue or assign blame, but to understand whether what we had was still rooted in trust. Reading his words, I felt fear and resolve intertwine. The conversation ahead promised no easy answers, only the chance to face what I had already delayed too long. As I prepared to leave the apartment, I paused in the hallway, aware of how ordinary everything looked. No dramatic markers, no visible signs of change, just a space that had witnessed a turning point I would carry with me. I realized then that infidelity doesn't always announce itself through scandal. Sometimes it reveals itself through the quiet courage required to admit you've drifted off course. I stepped outside knowing the next chapter of my life would be shaped not by what I desired, but by what I chose to confront. Whether Daniel and I would find our way back to each other remained uncertain. What was certain was this: avoidance had cost me enough, and as the door closed behind me, I understood that the hardest part of any story isn't the moment everything changes, it's deciding what kind of person you become once it has.